Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scott McKay.
How's it going, gentlemen? Welcome to yet again another episode of the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. As always, I am your host, Scott McKay, at Scott McKay on just about every social media outlet. And if you haven't joined our Facebook group, the Mountaintop Summit yet, gentlemen, you should be there. We're having a lot of fun. And more and more guys are joining it every day. The website is mountaintoppodcast.com. Lots of downloadable goodies there. And most importantly of all, we've got a great topic for you today. Returning is my old friend, Derek Loudermilk from St. Louis. You may have known him in the past as the guy who was the grand honcho over at the Art of Adventure podcast. And Derek is still very much an adventurer. Nowadays, he's turned a lot of his attention to the supernatural and kind of metaphysical ways that humans can get in touch with the universe and with God and indeed with each other at a higher level. And you know I love talking about all this stuff. Derek has compiled, get this, ready? 100 different areas of supernatural endeavor that he has dabbled in and perhaps even mastered, all of which have opened his mind to just really cool stuff in terms of being a human being in general. But the focus of today's show, of course, as always, is helping us all transform ourselves into being even better men than we are today and doing better with the women in our lives. And I will also add that Derek does have a very happy relationship with his honey, Heidi, his Heidi honey, right? Is that a Heidi honey? But probably without anything further, we should get on with it. Derek, welcome back, man. Good to hear from you.
Hey, Scott, it's great to be here.
Yeah, man. So this all started with that funky Facebook post of yours where you just kind of threw out on the table all these different supernatural things that you've been up to and actually had partaken of successfully. Some of those items on the list, well, you know, some of them were pretty run-of-the-mill, like, you know, lucid dreaming. I mean, run-of-the-mill, right? But things we've heard of before, things we've talked about before, even on this show. But some of them were just freaking amazing to me. I mean, that's what caused me to respond. Is you said you had experienced time travel and bending time, which I'm like, oh, come on, man. Does this guy have a DeLorean or what's going on over there? So, one thing led to another, and here we are making a podcast of it. So I'm just going to let you riff on this, man, and tell these guys, and me too, because I'm on pins and needles here. I can't wait to hear this. What you've been up to the past few years, how one thing led to another here, and man, you're going to have to talk to us about this time stuff.
Yeah. So, you know, I was traveling the world doing all these adventures. And I think a lot of adventurers' experiences, they start having these really wild, let's call them non-ordinary experiences where it's like not your typical reality. I had this, probably the first one I had was meeting what I call this magical 1,000-year-old tree when I was living in Bali. That gave me my first sort of out-of-body experience. And as a scientist, you know, I have a background in science. So I was trying to figure out, you know, how did this happen? There's got to be a mechanism that this tree was able to like project my consciousness halfway across the world. And I started just kind of studying, you know, different magical esoteric traditions and to try to figure out, okay, what is the physics that explains how all this works? Because I figure if I experience it, then there's a mechanism somewhere that allowed it to happen. So I studied, you know, consciousness and meditation and all these things. And it kind of became a quest to see all the different things that I could try. And that post that you're talking about, that Facebook post, was really just me asking people, what else should I try that I haven't experienced? You know, I said, here's what I've tried. I'm like 3/4 of the way through my quest to try 100 experiences. And there are so many that I had never even heard of, you know, that now I've got to look up and see if I want to test them out. But yeah, time travel was definitely one of those where probably 5 years ago, I wouldn't have really considered it as a possibility. But when you think about what time is, it's really the fourth dimension. So we've got the three dimensions of physical space, which are useful merely for like placing ourselves as coordinates, like here's where our physical body is in space. And then time really is also a construct that allows us to place ourselves in, let's call it a series of experiences. Because for us as humans, time sort of flows in a single direction, right? We experience it as linearity, but it's, a higher dimensional perspective. That is to say, like a fifth dimensional perspective and above, you could sort of perceive all points of time simultaneously. So it's partly about where our perception is. And so my theory was that in order to time travel, I would simply have to have the ability to change my perspective about where I was perceiving time.
Well, that's fascinating, and I want to talk about it, but I think these guys are still stuck on that point you made about 3 or 4 minutes ago about projecting your consciousness through a 1,000-year-old tree. What does that even look like?
I mean, I've talked to other adventurers that have had similar experiences. So this seems to be something that happens with trees in particular. They seem to be the type of organism that can facilitate this experience. And essentially, I was walking through the jungle and came across this beautiful tree, and it has 3 trunks that are all 30 feet around, and they eventually come together, 100 feet up in the air. So it's a very beautiful, impressive tree just from appearances. But I placed my hands on the tree, and it was like touching a live wire. It was like an electric shock. And it was the flood of emotions, sort of experiencing all kinds of waves of emotion and sweating profusely just from touching this tree. And my girlfriend at the time, I was with her, and she said, I think you need to sit here with this tree and see the full experience that you'll have. And so I sat down there kind of like in the roots of the tree. And that's when my consciousness was, let's call it, projected to a different part of the world, that is a forest in China. And in this particular forest, I got this vision of the desert, the Gobi Desert, which is in northwest China, was basically the sand was filling the forest, and the forest was dying, and the desert was growing and expanding. And it's this real thing that's happening. You can look it up, but it's also a metaphor of the beautiful growing part of our world getting taken over by essentially like sand, deadly sand, which our environments all over the place are getting degraded. And so really this tree was kind of giving me a mission to take people into nature, to bring leaders and entrepreneurs into the wilderness to remind themselves, you're a human, but that means you're also a biological organism. You're part of the whole ecosystem. You're not separate from the world. And this is something that's really important, I think, culturally, personally, to realize, like, we are not separated from the systems that makes the whole. We are a key part of the whole of the Earth's ecosystems. And so that actually eventually led to also me creating these retreats, which I call Adventure Quest, where I take groups of entrepreneurs, groups of leaders on these, week-long adventure trips. So it led to both the sort of inquiry, the quest, and also a business, because I was like, well, if I'm going to get people out into the wilderness, I need to frame it in such a way that they're actually going to want to go and rediscover this for themselves.
So all these mofos are listening to this. They're going to be out in their backyards after they're done with this show, kind of looking around to make sure the neighbors aren't looking. Then they're going to start feeling up their trees to see if anything happens. That's what's going to go on.
And, you totally should, because you might be surprised if one of these trees starts chatting to you. Starts like,
I know I would be shocked. I'd check myself. I mean, it seems really far out, Derek. I mean, we swung for the fence on this first one. And probably on that note, I want to circle back, Jen Psaki style, and absolutely acknowledge something you just said, which is the importance of taking these ostensibly supernatural experiences and applying science to them. I mean, well, first of all, I was just commenting about this on Twitter earlier today. When's the last time you heard someone use the phrase follow the science? That kind of fell out of vogue lately. But still, if there is a scientific method to be had and it can be applied, all sorts of things I will fully acknowledge that we think of as supernatural are actually perfectly physically logical and obey the laws of physics. A couple that come to mind offhand on the surface and in terms of religious belief are directly in conflict with other faiths. And, you know, I come from a Christian background, but also like you, I have traveled all over the world and seen a whole lot of things and been very open-minded about culture. And one of the things I've realized is that chakras are very real. If you start talking about the phenomena associated with checking your chakras, getting in touch with them, clearing them, it is absolutely anathema to Christian belief that you would even go there. Some would even say it's satanic. But even within the context of, you know, Western culture, which is rooted in Judeo-Christian thought, of course, you know, we feel with our heart, right? We think with our head. We feel sexual attraction in our loins. And people don't give much thought to that, right? But indeed, that's what chakras are about, are different energy spots in your body assigned to different emotions and states and feelings. Like when you worry, you feel in your gut. It's a gut feeling, right? And dread is right there in our solar plexus. All of this is something that people who believe in chakras and are from that tradition are well acquainted with. Which one of us who has a daughter, and you do too, and so do I, has not kissed our little daughter on the forehead at night to make her feel safe and well protected and taken care of before she falls asleep? That's all about the chakra, you know, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And there's physiology to define it. Another one is Tai Chi. My wife and I took Air China from SFO over to Beijing one time. And after this long flight, they started running Tai Chi exercises you could partake of from your airline seat before we got on the final approach. And my wife and I just looked at each other and shrugged and said, why not? And my goodness, we felt refreshed immediately. There was something absolutely scientifically valid at the physiological level about doing the Tai Chi. Although once again, to the Judeo-Christian mindset, that seems Buddhist or something. And, you know, you don't want to do it. You know what I mean? So I can not only resonate with everything you're saying about the scientific element to these things that we don't understand and automatically consider to be weird or otherworldly, and I actually applaud it. So, you know, man, tell us more. Give us more examples. You're
totally on the right track. And speaking of Tai Chi, there's masters that can concentrate their chi, which is their life force energy, in such a way that they can, you know, physically shoot lightning out of their fingers or blow onto paper and start it on fire. And there's, you know, plenty of video evidence of this if you want to go search it on YouTube. But so here's a physical phenomenon, like we observe a phenomenon. And then the next step in the scientific process is, okay, that's curious. Do I have an explanation, like a potential theory about how that's working? And then can I design something that allows me to investigate that? Now, sometimes you can measure things, like you can measure the electric field of the heart, which radiates out from the body 12 feet around you. So if you're in a room full of people, your heart fields are all interacting sometimes before you even go have a conversation with someone. And they've shown that you can sort of, if you're really in a highly positive state and your heart field is really strong, you can come into a room and it changes the fields of everybody else and lifts everyone's moods, right? So these are like measurable things, but there's also, because thoughts and consciousness sort of precedes the material world, that is to say, like the basic Newtonian laws of physics, there's sometimes when you can't measure things, like you can't really measure, for example, where you go when you're dreaming, or you can't measure if you want something really badly, you can't necessarily measure with an instrument how strongly that desire is attracting that into your life. But we know that these things are having an effect, and they're probably measurable on a different level.
Well, dreaming in general is such a fascinating rabbit hole to go down when you're considering the link between what we consider to be the natural world and some other dimension. You and I are both lucid dreamers, and it's amazing to me, kind of going along with the meat and potatoes of this conversation so far, that when people don't understand something logically, they often simply dismiss it. Like, oh, that's ridiculous. That's not true, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, a huge example there, even in our natural world, is female ejaculation. People are like, oh, she's just peeing. That's just a story. Then when they give the woman in their life a squirting orgasm for the first time, they're like, oh my goodness, this is real. So like the first time you experience a real honest to goodness lucid dream, you wake up going, so that's what they mean when they're talking about only using like 20% of your brain power. I just freaking created an entire universe, an entire reality on the fly inside my own head. Wowzers, right? And then you start talking to other people about it, and you're immediately an evangelist for it because, well, of course you are. It's crazy, amazing. And people are just rolling their eyes going, yeah, you know, you're a real weirdo. So it's fascinating to me how so much of the technology we enjoy nowadays is, I mean, good grief. I was going to say like 100 years old or less. A lot of it is like 10 years old or less, especially, you know, some of the stuff I dare say they haven't really let us in on yet. And yet people are still so arrogant, even as temporal mortal human beings, aren't we all, Derek, when it comes to really allowing for some knowledge that we really haven't wrapped our heads around yet. Like this heart field thing that you're talking about. You know, I say that so glibly, right? This heart field thing. Nobody knows about that. Yet I'm sure it's completely real. It's just something that is at the frontier of human knowledge and estimation, let alone what we do with it, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned something about the brain, and we only use 20% of our brain power.
Well, whatever percentage it is, right? You know,
there's some fascinating brain research which basically flips. You know, a lot of people used to believe in neuroscience, in brain science, that the brain created our experience of reality. But what they've discovered is that the brain is actually a filter for consciousness. That is to say, it's a reducing valve so that we can understand our experience here on Earth. So we're limited to just our five senses. We have physical bodies, and essentially, like, in order to just experience the senses, you know, like we see the rainbow of colors, and that's only a tiny bandwidth of visible light, for example.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You know, one thing that goes along with that, I don't mean to interrupt you because I seldom do anymore on this show because my listeners don't like that. But I was reading relatively recently that they have scientifically proven that certain species on this earth can see another primary color we can't.
Mm. You know what that color is called?
No, we can't even imagine it. I mean, imagine, you know, another primary color. I mean, obviously you have light in the absence of light, black and white, but we literally see the millions of colors we see within the context of a rainbow of blue, red, and yellow.
Yeah, it's like the Predator, right? In the movie, like he could just shift, and it's just the electromagnetic, you know, spectrum. So, right, you can see infrared or ultraviolet. You know, butterflies can see ultraviolet. That's how they know which flowers to land on and whatnot.
Yes, amazing.
So the brain of humans and presumably most mammals is it's really squeezing down our perceptions to a level where we can comprehend what's actually going on. Because otherwise it's just too much infinity for us to really understand on a physical level.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Let me go ahead and throw some ideas out that are your ideas that you wrote down. I know you wanted to talk, first of all, and this is low-hanging fruit, about telekinesis, telepathy, and remote viewing. I don't think those terms are particularly new to the men listening. I mean, remote viewing might be, but talk to us about your direct experience with that and what happened and how you become a better man because of it.
Well, yeah, there's fantastic applications like for your life as a man, which is great. But let's talk a little bit about the science behind how all this works. And it's really the same thing. Telepathy is mind to mind communication. So instead of talking with words in your mouth, you're just sending the information from your mind to someone else's mind. And remote viewing, there is the psychic spy program, which started in the Navy, which went for 20 years. It's called the Stargate program. You can look it all up. They were doing things like viewing Russian military bases or trying to get political intel by having these people sit in a laboratory setting here in the States and viewing anywhere in the world. And they were getting really good data. You can verify this stuff. You can say, okay, look inside this safe and tell me what's in there. And then either you're right or you're wrong. And so these are things that are testable and verifiable. And they developed essentially a program where it would allow people to train themselves to be nearly perfectly accurate of how they're perceiving something remotely. And they call it remote viewing. That is because they're getting information about something that is not in their same location. But really the reason this is possible, telepathy or remote viewing or any of these is possible, is because of quantum entanglement. That is to say, we are all infinitely entangled with everything. And so the connection you need to perceive what's in that safe or what's in that military base already exists. And it's about turning your attention to that connection, and then the information will arrive in your awareness.
What are the mechanics of that?
It's really simple. It's like if you're in a restaurant, you're paying attention to the people at your table, but you could turn your attention to maybe trying to listen across the room, and you perceive a conversation that someone else is having across the room, or you notice who's coming in the door when they arrive, and you try to sense if they're a friendly person or not. There's different ways you can direct your attention, and you get different pieces of information. And due to basically quantum entanglement, every photon of the universe has encountered every photon of the universe before, and there's an element of entanglement that allows you to access that information at any time, any place.
How do we start exercising and training those muscles, Derek, so we can be more like you and get some of this stuff done in our own lives?
Yeah, so the really simple practice is the very first telepathy experiment, for example, was they would track who's calling you, right? So the experiment was set up. Here's 4 possible people who are going to call you, and you don't know who it's going to be, but when the phone rings, you just write down who you think it is, and then you pick it up and find out who it is. And they did this experiment, and they showed that about twice as frequently as you would expect by chance, right? If there's 4 people, you'd expect 25%, and it was something like 37% accurate. So people know who's calling them. So you can do little predictions like this. Okay, who's calling me? Am I right or not? Or you could set up a bunch of envelopes, have somebody put photos in the envelopes and seal them up, and then try to guess what the picture in the envelope is, and then open it up and test yourself. And it really is a practice, because sometimes you might, a common one we've used is it's a picture of Michael Jackson, dancing with some brightly colors. So it's like the image is very striking, and people will pick up things like, oh, it's a man in a hat, and this person is very famous, but also self-conscious. And so they'll pick up little bits of information, like they couldn't tell who it was, but they could tell someone was dancing, or they could tell the person was famous. So you don't get a complete picture. Just like if I showed you a picture for 10 seconds and I had you describe it back to me, you would remember part of it, but not all of it. So it's about training yourself to observe what's coming into your awareness and then testing it by getting feedback and checking to see if you were right or not.
What would you say to guys who are listening to this show who are surmising at this point, this kind of feels like going to a fortune teller or going to one of those stage shows where the guy pretends he's clairvoyant? There's something to this ability this person has to see into my life and to guess what's going on and have it be amazingly true to my life. But even they admit, if they're honest, that there's a rhythm and a flow to this. It isn't necessarily supernatural. Is that kind of what you're saying here? Is this is all a lot more scientific than it is supernatural all the way around? Or is what they're doing as performance kayfabe, for lack of a better way to put it, something completely different than what you're talking about?
Well, so you could have two different types of performers. You could have a performer who's relying on his ability to read body language, and like if he's like, I sense that you have a sister, or no, maybe it's a brother, and then the person's like opens their eyes like, I do have a brother. Like maybe they're reading the audience response and they're really good at that. Or maybe they're actually clairvoyant and they're just getting the proper information. And the way to sort of differentiate between someone who's relying on a developed skill for just assessing the body language of the person versus someone who's actually getting information is to make it all blind. That is to say, neither the person providing the information or the person reading the information has any prior knowledge about anything. So that is to say, like, if I made the 7 envelopes with pictures in it and then gave it to another person and didn't tell them what's in the envelope and had them run the experiment, then nobody would know anything about what's in the envelopes. And so it would all be based on, am I actually seeing inside the envelopes or not?
So what you're saying, though, is when people are told to relax, really get into this, trust their feelings, then they're more likely to be correct more often than anybody thought would be possible on the surface.
Yeah, and you make a good point. Like one of the hardest things to train is trusting. So let's say you did get an image of, I don't know, the Eiffel Tower, and you thought, I wonder if one of these pictures is the Eiffel Tower. But then you're like, no, nobody would put an Eiffel Tower in there. It's too obvious. And you start thinking about it, right? Then you start applying your logical analysis of what you think it might be, rather than just trusting that you got some piece of information. Maybe it's a pointy toy or something. Who knows exactly what the picture is? There's a difference between getting information and then interpreting it. And they actually did a big study with CEOs, and CEOs that did better on this task, that is to say, sort of using their intuitive psychic abilities, had way more profitable companies. So that is to say, CEOs that listen to their gut more and don't overanalyze the instincts, their companies are more profitable.
So I was about to bring up that whole idea of trusting one's gut, because I think that's a lot more mainstream than some of these supernatural things. But it sounds to me like trusting one's gut is right along the same lines as what you're talking about. It just is something more people perhaps are more acquainted with. And what you're saying then, if I may make such a bold conclusion, is that trusting one's gut is actually rooted in science also.
It is, yeah. And we often, will say like, you messed up the results to this experiment because you put an analytical overlay, or you put your own imagination or your own interpretation of reality upon the information that you're getting. And there's a practice for simply observing the world as it is. That is to say, without judging anything or without making a conclusion about what it means. And so we'll say, okay, you go into a room, you're at a holiday party, or you're at some event, and I want you to simply observe without judgment. How does it feel? What does the light look like here? What is the ambiance? How loud is it? Or, what are the objects in the room? And getting really good at just observing, separate from judging or making decisions about things, can serve people really well as they learn to trust themselves.
That's already making us into a better man right there. I know you wanted to talk about Ho'oponopono, which if any of the guys are familiar with that Hawaiian turn of phrase, it's probably from a Tony Robbins gig where he talks about the power of saying, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, I love you. Those 4 phrases stacked on top of each other to create a result of renewed human connection with someone in particular. Go ahead and give us your take on it, because I know it's a little deeper than that.
Yeah, this is, I realize this can be applied to almost anything in life. And we can go back to quantum entanglement, or you can look at it from perspective of God is everything, right? So in essence, we are like a smaller aspect, a fractal of the whole. We are a fractal of divinity, a fractal of God. That is, in the holographic universe principle, the whole universe is represented within us. So if we want to change anything outside of us, if we want more money or a better relationship, or we want the war in Ukraine to stop, or whatever it may be, there's a reflection of that within inside of us. So what aspect of the war in Ukraine is present inside of you that you can forgive, that you can apply compassion to? Like, oh, wow, I'm actually aggressive sometimes, or I actually want to make my kids take their bath and I just want to demand that they do it and they have to listen. I want to control them to some degree because it'll just make my life easier. Or, whatever it is, there's an element of the external that is reflected inside of you. And when you apply Ho'oponopono to yourself, that is forgiving that aspect within inside yourself, then it changes in the outside world, or it can affect change in the outside world. And there's this famous case of this Hawaiian doctor. He was in a mental institution, sort of the violent offenders, and he basically spent all of his time just forgiving himself for everything that these inmates had done. And pretty soon, everyone in the whole mental hospital was healed and released, and they shut the whole thing down because they no longer needed it. But he wasn't actually going and doing like therapy sessions with them or casework or anything like that. He was just sitting in his office forgiving himself for everything that these people had done. And all of a sudden, everything was fixed. And so I started applying this to myself. Whatever I saw in the world that I didn't like, or if it was like, okay, if I want to earn more money, then what is it within myself that needs to be given compassion or acknowledgement that can heal in order to open this possibility of, more money or abundance or something like that.
Yeah, talk about masculine leadership. That's like a whole new level. Derek, we could talk about this all day long. You have a list here of 100 you've personally partaken of, and we've talked about like 6 or 7. What I want to do is I want to send these guys to your website so they can just dig in and gorge themselves on your ideas, because they're so fascinating and backed by your own personal experience, which I think makes it extra, extra fascinating. So, gentlemen, if you go to mountaintoppodcast.com/Derek, you will be magically teleported, of course, right? Supernaturally teleported.
Yeah, the internet's pretty magical.
Right? To DerekLoudermilk.com, where you will find out a whole lot more about what's been taking a lot of Derek Loudermilk's time and occupying a whole lot of his imagination lately. I also want to send you to mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon, where you'll find my Amazon influencer page. Right there at the top of the queue is Derek Loudermilk's famous book nowadays called Activate Your Life. He sold over 30,000 copies of it. Maybe yours can be the 30,001st. Look for Activate Your Life at the top of the queue at mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon. Derek, man, good to hear your voice and have a fascinating conversation with you. Thank you so much for a great show, and come back soon, man. It's been too long.
Yeah, Scott, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Yeah. And gentlemen, if you haven't been to mountaintoppodcast.com lately, hey, it's 2023. Talk about being a better man. Come talk to me for free for 25 minutes. You'll find me to be exactly the guy you expect me to be. And if you so choose, we can put a plan of action in place to get the right woman in your life this year, once and for all. You can get on my calendar at mountaintoppodcast.com. You can check in with my newest program, Unsettled, which helps you not only to maximize what you're doing with your life right now, but also guys are reporting that it really helps them kick that Mr. Nice Guy tendency right out of their lives. So powerful program there called Unsettled. You can learn more about that at the website. Also check in with this month's master class. We did a great one last month on dating multiple women, which I know seems like a fantasy to a whole lot of guys. Well, we turned that into reality for quite a number of guys, and you could be next. You can get your hands on that master class thanks to the Evergreen download portal where it now resides. If you haven't checked out Origin in Maine, herosoap.com or Keyport, those are our 3 main sponsors. They're all our sponsors for a reason, guys. They have great products. They've all been on board for over 3 years now. You know I believe in the products, and I believe you should too. If you choose to partake of anything from Origin in Maine, Hero Soap, or Keyport, please use the coupon code MOUNTAIN10 for an additional 10% off. All that and more, including free downloads of several of my books, are all there for you at the candy store, which is mountaintoppodcast.com. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scott McKay from X&Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X&Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X&Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.